Liz, it's so wonderful to have you here. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I just want to start by just talking about the work. You were, as Cece mentioned, your series of 4 essays in 2022 was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. You reported on capital punishment in Alabama. What led you there? What led you to think that these stories were worth and important to tell? Yeah.
So I've been interested in the death penalty for a long time, and I had written about it when I was at the New York Times. I had witnessed a federal execution under Trump and Barr. And, essentially, I think it was in July of last year, I got a tip that there had been an execution in Alabama that had gone wrong. It had taken 3 hours. The individual who was being executed, Joe Nathan James, was not conscious at the time of his execution, which is extremely rare. A person has to be read their death warrant and offered the opportunity to give last words. So for someone to be totally unconscious is not only inexplicable, it's against protocol. And so there was a mystery there that, was a suitable subject for investigation of journalism. And I went to Alabama. Joe Nathan James' family agreed to have an independent autopsy. That gave me the opportunity to attend the autopsy and view his body and try to get a sense of what had happened. The execution was botched. It was seriously botched. They had cut into his arm with some kind of blade, looking for a vein they could identify visually because they couldn't find a vein in the typical way. This is called a venous cut down. It's not something that's done in hospitals in the United States anymore. Maybe there was a time, but nowadays they use an ultrasound machine. It wasn't even clear what kind of sharp instrument the execution team would have had because they're not back there with scalpels. So it wasn't even clear how that had happened. And so I looked into his execution, and then it became pretty clear to me, looking at his body, that Alabama had a serious problem on their hands. They were not competent to carry out executions according to their own protocol. So they had a couple of guys scheduled next, Alan Miller and Kenny Smith. I got in touch with Alan and Kenny and attended both of their executions. Both of them survived their executions. That's how incompetent Alabama was at the time to actually carry out executions. So that was the origin of all of that reporting, just trying to understand what was going on in Alabama's death chamber. In my mind, it's not the fact that executions are often botched or even that executions sometimes happen to innocent people that makes capital punishment morally wrong. But I thought this was all a good example of the many ways it can go wrong and the sort of misadventures you can get into.
Yeah, that is one of the things that's striking about the essays, which is so much of the conversation among those who oppose the death penalty is driven by efforts like the Innocence Project, which are wonderful, which is, sometimes it's very clear we've quote unquote sort of not killed the right people or killed the wrong people. Your essays, though, you focus on people with which there's no ambiguity about whether they committed the crime for which they were sentenced. And you describe the crimes that they committed with in as much graphic, if not more so graphic sort of detail. You don't sort of sand off the edges of the crimes that they committed by any means. And so what point are you trying to make in doing that and having readers sort of come to full terms with the crimes that these folks that they committed?
So, as you said, so much of death penalty activism has to do with innocent people being executed, and that's because we all already agree that innocent people shouldn't be executed. That's something that nobody is actually advocating for. And So the Innocence Project and other organizations that aim at sort of identifying posthumous exonerations, et cetera, they are doing wonderful work, and they've done quite a bit to, I think, sort of put cracks in the foundation of death penalty advocacy, right? Because it introduces doubt into the process, and I think that's useful in terms of activism. But in terms of journalism and what I'm trying to do, for one, I think readers know if you're trying to sort of hide the ball. They want to know what the person did that put them on death row. To me, the crimes, the offenses that were committed are part of the person's story. And they're a critical and important part of the person's story. But they're not the end, right? There's a huge amount of time. I think over 50% of people in the United States who are on death row have been there for more than 18 years. So there's a long life that transpires after the offense. And sometimes people have been on death row for much more than 18 years. So by the time you encounter someone who once committed an offense like that and they've been on death row for 20, 25 years, you're just encountering a completely different person, just by nature of age. Burl Cain, who's the commissioner of the Mississippi Department of Corrections now, but used to be the warden of Angola in Louisiana, talks about something he calls criminal menopause, which is, you get to a certain age, and statistics bear this out, you just don't see a lot of crime after a certain age. And I want to bring the whole story of the individual to the reader. And I think what I'm trying to do there is to say the death penalty is wrong, even in cases where guilt is unquestionable, even in cases where the crime is heinous. These are the cases that I handpick. And if you make the case that the death penalty is wrong, even in the most heinous and obviously guilty cases, then you've made the maximal case against the death penalty. You're not making a sort of provisional case. You're making the full maximal case, which is even in the worst situations where guilt is absolutely guaranteed, the death penalty is still wrong for various reasons. And that's what I'm trying to do, I think.
Yeah. You don't focus on this really explicitly in the essays, but it comes up a bit just as you're writing them, and then I've heard you give other talks. Your writing became sort of, there are some of the criminal justice officials, some of the folks, some of the law enforcement folks mentioned to you, as well as some of the folks on death row, like your articles. I think you said, I think I remember in one of the essays, you said one of the inmates asked about a previous execution, and someone said, you don't believe everything that you read. It also, you had folks on death row, and imagine still do, reaching out to you. And then, of course, your reporting reached policymakers and affected concrete, if fleeting, policy change. What was that like on all three levels, to see your work sort of very directly and obviously influence policymakers' decision-making, and then to see it become sort of part of the life of the criminal justice system that you were reporting on?
During Alan Miller's execution, which was after Joe Nathan James' botched execution, he asked the executioners, "Are you going to cut me up like Joe Nathan James?" And one of the executioners replied, "Don't believe everything that you read," which is a hell of a thing to say to someone that you're trying to kill, to get into sort of a petty argument with them. But I was mad as a hornet when I heard that, because you can believe what I write in The Atlantic. It's thoroughly fact-checked. And I felt like this was someone who, under state-guaranteed anonymity, was arguing with my work. And I felt like, come out and face me. Say it to my face. Tell me what's wrong. Ask for a correction. Yes. What do I need to correct?
Yes.
Right? And no request for a correction was ever submitted by the Alabama Department of Corrections. They never asked for a change in an article. They could never identify anything that we hadn't verified. And so my invitation to this guy, whoever he is out there in Alabama, to come say it to my face remains completely open, and I would love to have a conversation with that guy. In terms of the moratorium that happened, I mean, there were a lot of reasons for the moratorium to happen. It certainly wasn't just my writing. My writing, I think, brought some attention to this situation that was transpiring in Alabama, and it probably would have resulted in a moratorium anyway, just because there was no question that their execution process was broken, and they didn't want to have any more execution survivors. And you know, it was an incredibly emotional time. You know, in the process of journalism, maybe some people, I mean, I'm sure that they can separate themselves into sort of a professional, public-facing journalist, and then a private person with their own emotions and judgments and feelings. But I can't do that. When I interact with someone, when I build a relationship with a source, be they a person on death row or a former guard or a paramedic, you know, anyone involved in the process, that relationship is real. It's not a strictly transactional relationship formed to extract information out of a person. I have my genuine feelings go into it. And so, you know, going to the execution of a guy like Alan, where I was sitting with his family members when they told us the execution had been called off, it was extremely emotional. And the same thing then happened with Kenny. And now the state of Alabama wants to schedule both of them for another execution, for their second executions. And they want to use nitrogen hypoxia, death by suffocation via gas. So, I mean, that continues to be something that is heavy on my mind.
Liz, you've written and talked about the theme of forgiveness. It does come up in these essays quite a bit, but you've also written about it sort of separately. I'm wondering if in your mind, do you, and if so, like, how do you connect the theme of the idea of forgiveness, the virtue of forgiveness, with capital punishment and this body of work?
Well, what's remarkable to me is I've seen forgiveness sort of growing in the wild in these cases. Joe Nathan James had murdered his ex-girlfriend. He shot her to death. She had 2 young children, and at the time of his execution, both of her children and her brother protested the execution, didn't want it, said they had forgiven him and that she would have wanted them to forgive him. But the state is totally insensitive to victims' families who say that they have forgiven and they don't want an execution. The same thing happened in Jimmy Barber's case. Jimmy Barber, under the influence of a lot of drugs, sort of mixed drug intoxication, murdered the elderly grandmother of, or the elderly mother of a woman he'd been dating. And her granddaughter and her daughter ended up forgiving Jimmy. They wrote letters with him. They talked to him in his final days. They went to prison to meet him, and they forgave him. And what I see in the forgiveness that I've witnessed just doing this work is that forgiveness is a gift you give to other people. I think we have a very therapeutic idea of forgiveness culturally, where it's something you do for yourself to help you let go and help you recover. But that's not always how forgiveness goes down. When you forgive someone, it's still completely possible to feel emotionally damaged and hurt and very attached in certain ways to the wrong that was done against you, because it's part of your story, it's part of your life. But what I see in the forgiveness that I've witnessed is forgiveness is an act of charity. It's something done out of love, and it's something done out of consideration for the other person, because it releases them from this deed that they've done that makes them, you know, when you do a bad thing, you morally injure yourself. You reduce what you were when you harm someone when you do a bad thing. Forgiveness raises someone back up to where they were before they committed the bad act. It releases them in some sense, and it frees them. And, the Bible says, as far as the east is from the west, God removes us from our sins, right? That's what forgiveness does. It restores people.
One of the more moving, sort of troubling aspects is you raise like the weight that family members feel of somehow. I mean, you said that politicians aren't sensitive to sort of the wishes of the family, and yet, as your reporting shows, and just as we could see, politicians are quite willing to leverage when the families do want capital punishment to be pursued. So the sensitivity only works in certain directions, and I'm just really struck by the state not releasing family members from feeling like they are somehow complicit in capital punishment and the death penalty, in the ending of the life of someone that they don't want to be a part of, and that your work helped elucidate that for me.
Yeah, I think it's an incredible moral burden on the victim's family because the state wants them to behave in a certain way and wants them to have a certain reaction. So once the prosecutor has secured the death penalty, they really want the family of the victim, to support that sentence. But as I said earlier, there's oftentimes 20, 25 years between the securing of the sentence and the time of the execution. And during that time, people can radically change in their feelings about the offense, in their feelings about the offender. And I've seen that so many times at this point. There's a gentleman who's a friend of mine in Texas named John Sage, and he founded the prison ministry Bridges to Life, which is about reconciliation and forgiveness, because his sister was murdered by two people in the 90s in Houston. And at the time, he wanted the death sentence for both of these people. One of them died of AIDS in prison. The other one is one of the handful of women on Texas death row. She's still alive. And over time, through this ministry that he worked for reconciliation and forgiveness, his own feelings about her and her sentence changed. And he no longer wanted to be an impetus for the state to carry out this death sentence. And so he intervened on her behalf by talking to Houston's prosecutor, Kim Ogg, and essentially saying, the victim's family no longer wants this. Several of his siblings also joined him in that conversation. And I can't help but feel like it's a little unfair that the state wants to use victims' families to advance executions. When victims' families are in favor of executions, they're often given sort of TV time and they're handheld through the process by the state.
They deserve justice.
Right, they deserve justice. We're doing this for the victim's family. But when the victim's family doesn't want the death penalty, or when they've changed their feelings over time, the state is just unresponsive to them. They don't even get contacted by the Attorney General's office or by the Department of Corrections. They just get radio silence. And I mean, to me, you're putting them in the position of being the impetus, the catalyst for something they no longer want, that isn't going to serve them. And so, that's one of the many reasons I think that the death penalty is just a flawed policy.
We honored Sister Norma Pimentel last night. We had a conversation with Gary Haugen at International Justice Mission. We have folks in the audience who are serving in dark places. And I'm interested, for you, what does it mean to stay human, to have perseverance in work that is can can be emotionally sort of suffocating, that can be a burden for you to bear. I know it might seem sort of, and I think this is part of the problem. People who work in fields of injustice, it seems like a real novelty to focus on, well, how am I processing this? But I also know we have folks doing amazing work who are thinking, I don't know if I could do this for another 6 months. I don't know if I could do this for another week. What does it look like for you to, what resources do you draw on to do the work that you do? Yeah.
Yes, it can be extremely difficult emotionally. I've gotten very depressed doing this work at times because like I said, you build these relationships with people and then they get killed in front of you. That's what it is to witness an execution. You see someone that you've been talking to for 6 months, 8 months, be put to death right before your eyes, not a yard from you. And then that relationship, which you've worked to cultivate all this time, is just terminated. And there are guys that I miss, and I find that very difficult. I found that hard. I'm the person sort of least affected by what's going on. Certainly the person who's being executed, their family, these are people who are suffering the sort of blunt impact of everything that's happening. I'm just a witness. So what's happening to me is very secondary. But it does get tough at times. I just try to keep an open heart. One of the things that strikes me about Jesus, who's our example, is he's totally open-hearted. Everyone who comes, he listens to, he talks with, he takes all comers. And it doesn't matter what the person has done or what's going on with them in terms of their spiritual development or their relationship to their sins. He's just open-hearted and willing to listen. And I think a lot about his example. I have a lot of prayers that I say regularly. I wear my miraculous medal. I never take it off. And I just do a lot of praying. And one figure I think about a lot is Mary Magdalene, right? Because she sticks around for the crucifixion. She goes to the tomb. Even though she can't stop what's happening, she supports Jesus Christ with her presence. She doesn't walk away. She witnesses everything that happens. And she's willing to see that through to the very end. And so when I meet a guy and I'm talking to him about, and this is just because I haven't worked with a woman before. There are women on death row. But when I meet a guy and I'm talking to him about his situation, I just try to, I say, I'm going to be with you every step of the way. I can't stop what's happening. I can't intervene, but I'll be with you, and I won't run away, right? I'll be there until the very end. And that's what I try to do.
I think we often think that there's this sort of clean dichotomy between laws, politics, beltway, state capitals, and the kind of people we are, how we are in communities. But as you know, I think that it's not a one-to-one, it's not a perfect sort of mirror image, but in the end, I'm convinced that the state of our politics is a reflection of the state of our souls. And so what I want to ask you is, based on what you saw, what you reported on, what does the state of how we approach capital punishment, and maybe even like the surrounding issues, what does it reflect about what we think about God? Like, what does it reflect about what we think about the kind of world we live in?
I think just broadly, culturally, there's a sense that emanates from both sides of the political spectrum that there is this clear-cut difference between good and bad people, that there are good people who do good things and have good intentions and good intuitions, and then there are bad people who do bad things and have bad impulses and bad intentions, and we can easily delineate between the two. But, I studied Augustine when I was in graduate school, and my sense is there's good and evil inside all of us. Even someone who's done a terrible thing, there's still good in that person, and sometimes that good is just the imago Dei, the image of God. And if you believe that every person really bears the image of God, if you really believe it, right, that there's the indelible shape of the Lord of creation in every person, then you have to be against the destruction of human life. And, for me, that's across the board. Now, you can come to different conclusions about what the policy answer is to support the dignity of human life. But to me, the death penalty seems like such an obvious case where we have designated some people, worthless, without human dignity, without the image of God. And if some people can be designated that way, then everybody is at risk for, being demoted from humanity in that sense. And I think that's a major problem in our politics.
Liz, I want to thank you for being here. It is not always easy to be in public life. It's not always easy to be a writer. And you take a lot of, just when you're out in public, you take a lot of arrows, a lot of criticism. I think you are just such a beautiful gift to our public life. And I am so grateful that you do the work you do. I'm even more grateful for the kind of person that you are. And so really an honor to have you at our inaugural summit, and I'm grateful that you're a friend. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael.